Hello. Can you all hear me? Good. Well, it's good to see so many friendly faces. And I just want to start by saying that it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about a subject which is absolutely fascinating to me, and I hope will be of some interest to you. And I know many of you will be coming from some enterprise space, some on the more entrepreneurial side of things, so I hope this is interesting for both of you. My name is Iain McNiven. As the vast majority of you know, I am a data security engineer at Morgan Stanley, and I work in the sort of sub-discipline of data leakage prevention, which is going to be the topic of our conversation today, and I've been doing this job for 10 years. So DLP, or data leakage prevention, you might not have heard about, but it's essentially a sub-discipline within data security. And if you can imagine all the different ways that you might want to exfiltrate data from your company's desktop, network, all the various ways, you might email it, you might upload it to the web, you might put it on a USB stick, you might print it. There are many, many ways, and our job is to monitor those data channels and try and prevent people stealing our most sensitive data assets. So the topic of the discussion today is going to be around that, the sort of paradigm that we've been following for the last 10 years, and where we're going in the future, what the challenges are, and also what the opportunities are in that space. Maria is joining me. So Maria, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. My name's Maria. I also work in data leakage prevention at Morgan Stanley. Unlike Iain, I've not got 10 years under my belt. I started about 10 months ago after finishing my degree at Strathclyde Uni. So hopefully together we'll be able to provide two different perspectives on DLP, past and present, and where it's going in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So I did go into DLP like 10 years ago, and at the time it was not seen as a particularly fashionable thing to go into. So DLP, it was almost a cliche at the time to say DLP is a sort of dying technique, that we won't be doing this sort of channel monitoring method of securing our data for very much longer. Some people sort of advised me against it, and it wasn't very hard 10 years ago to find blog posts, articles proclaiming the imminent demise of DLP as a practice. So I want to sort of review what the basis of those predictions were, discuss why they didn't come true, what happened instead, and where I think we're going to go in the future with regards to DLP. So the general critique at the time was something like this, and it applied to many areas of security, not just DLP, that we had been in this model of security whereby we had almost like a sort of perimeter wall with one or two ways in and out of your organization. Your perimeter wall was comprised of your firewalls, your application security devices, your gateways, and there were one or two gates in and out of your network, your email gateway, your web gateway, maybe an SSH gateway. And if you were really advanced, maybe you had some concentric rings and you called it some sort of defense in depth network. This was the sort of traditional view of security at the time. And in that paradigm, DLP can work quite effectively. You can monitor all the emails going out of your system. You absolutely can monitor all the web traffic going out of your system, and you can try and prevent people stealing your most sensitive data assets. But over the course of the last 10 years, the world was changing, has changed drastically, and we've gone from quite a small, almost like a little castle wall with 3 or 4 entrances into our network through which people could steal our data, to this much more rambling city wall with dozens of ways in, many ways out, and it's just much more complex perimeter, and it's a much more porous perimeter. So data can go out via a multitude more ways. We've got people working from home, bring your own device, we've got various instant messaging platforms, we've got Internet of Things, and just the general complexity of our perimeter has increased massively. And in addition to that, we've also built upwards into the clouds. So the critique was DLP simply cannot keep up with this. You cannot monitor these dozens of ways in and out of your perimeter wall anymore. Okay, 3 or 4 was fine. You're not going to keep up. Now, interestingly, and thankfully for my career, this did not come to pass. So, in fact, the opposite happened. And over the course of the past 10 years, enterprises have vastly increased their DLP investment, their DLP teams, and the general focus on it. So just to give some examples, when I first joined, I was the only person doing this engineering work in Glasgow. There are now more than 10. And it's the same story in various offices around the globe. There's been a great refocus and reinvestment in channel monitoring where your data is going. Now this manifests itself in the fact that not only do we have many more people doing this, but we're also monitoring many more channels. So when I joined, we were maybe monitoring email, web, printers, and USBs. Now we're monitoring literally dozens of possible exfiltration channels. Some in real time, so instant messaging, various other messaging platforms. Some near real time in the cloud, so we try our best to monitor these data transfers. And some just after the fact by reviewing archive logs. So we've really expanded this old paradigm of where we were just monitoring 3 or 4 gateways in and out of our little castle, to now there are literally dozens. So the predictions didn't come true. In fact, the opposite came true, which was, beneficial for, I guess, my career, and I'm kind of glad I went into the field. This happened actually for several reasons. It wasn't just that our perimeters expanded, but at the time, so I joined Morgan Stanley in 2012. In the sort of years following that, there were a series of absolutely catastrophic data breaches in the industry for various companies. And anyone who was in the field in 2012, 2013 will remember these absolutely seismic events where companies suffered these catastrophic reputational damages. There were ramifications for people in the C-suite. So there were CEOs being replaced as a result of data breaches. And this just resulted in a huge refocusing of leadership into these data security and DLP areas, but also a massive uptick in regulatory scrutiny for what we were doing. At the time, it was a very small team of us doing it, and now it's a very large team. And the regulatory scrutiny went from not a huge burden to these regulators could now levy fines which would put you out of business, and they could literally throw named people in jail. So there was a huge sort of reinvestment in DLP. The predictions didn't come true. Now, before I sort of hand on to Maria to talk about where we're going now, I just want to discuss some other predictions that were happening around the time when I joined and started doing DLP. There were more nuanced perspectives on where we were going in this discipline. And I remember one meeting I had quite early in my career with a man who worked for one of the American intelligence services. And I remember he also predicted the demise of the channel monitoring paradigm of DLP along longer timescales. I think he predicted 10, 15 years we would see a complete shift. But interestingly, he also told me what we would shift to. So it was all well and good saying DLP's dead, but what's actually going to replace it? Because we do still need to secure our data. And he spoke of a paradigm which I think he had some experience of, but we didn't really generally in industry, where you wouldn't be doing this channel monitoring. You wouldn't really concern yourself with what was traversing your email gateway or your web gateway. But what you would be doing is you would be protecting your data assets in place using a mixture of digital rights management technologies, labeling technologies, and cloud-based permission technologies. And this is what we're going to talk about, this new paradigm. And at the time, it was very interesting to me. I was quite taken by this view of data security. It was almost like a sort of Copernican revolution in how you thought about securing your data assets. And all the technology at the time existed. The cryptographic foundations were laid decades in advance. Labeling technologies were very common. and we were already adopting cloud management 10 years ago. So all the technological foundations existed for this new data protection paradigm, but no one had actually pulled those together into an enterprise-ready solution which a company like ours could actually use at the time. So, it was a bit of a sort of interesting paradigm, but nothing really came out of it after I'd spoken to this person. Then, in the sort of intervening years, there were a few companies who started playing around with this idea of protecting your data in place, so encrypting it, sort of embedding the permissions of who can read this data and when within your unstructured data itself. So there was a fabulous Israeli company called Secure Islands who pulled together the sort of cryptographic foundations, the labeling, the cloud management, and actually brought to market a solution which could potentially solve this problem. And I remember at the time evaluating it and thinking, oh, this is great. Like, this is where we should be going with our industry. It then got snapped up by Microsoft, and it went quiet for a few years, around about the sort of 2015 mark. There were other big companies playing in this space, releasing potential competitors to this technology. But it wasn't until a few years later that Microsoft pulled Secure Islands off the shelf, rebranded it as AIP, Azure Information Protection, and later Microsoft Information Protection, that I sort of recognized that we now have a potential solution that we could use to try and achieve this new data security paradigm, which I'd heard a few years in the past. Now, I think we're still in the early days of adopting this kind of technology. Maria's going to tell us a little bit more about it. I'm going to talk about some challenges, some opportunities, and why I think we're now at the position where the demise of DLP, which was predicted for so long, may yet come to pass. So Maria, do you want to just talk a little bit about how we're doing this kind of MIP-based labeling?
Sure, yeah. So as Iain mentioned, labeling has been part of DLP for many years now, but there's challenges with just having a label on something. So without the kind of encryption and rights revocation that goes with it, if you just have a label saying this is highly confidential data, anybody that, heaven forbid, gets in your network is probably going to target that straight away. So at best, you can use these labels and policies to say, if you have an email that's got this highly confidential data in it, definitely try and block it. But the pessimist and the kind of negative approach would be anybody that gets in is just going to go straight for that. So this is kind of why we need to have the encryption and the rights revocation alongside the labeling to make it a kind of more well-rounded solution. So as Iain mentioned, AIP, Azure Information Protection, is kind of like a front runner in that area. We now call it Microsoft Information Protection, and this is a really good example of a cloud-native enterprise scalable solution. It offers encryption to go along with these labels. So say somebody did get in, found the label that said highly sensitive data and tried to exfiltrate it, it would all be encrypted. So even if it leaves, you can't read it. So that offers more protection and more reassurances. So that kind of goes along with the new approach to DLP that we're seeing more. So it includes encrypting, labeling, and permissioning your data as soon as you make it. So everything needs to have a label. So the way that kind of companies are starting this is that the user would say this is highly confidential. It will then get to the stage where a label is suggested, so something will pop up and say we think this is it, and eventually we'll get to the stage where the labels are automatically placed on your documents based on the content, so it's mandated. From there, each document or each bit of unstructured data will have rights associated with it. So the author of the data will say, this is who can access it, this is where they can access it, and this is how long they can access it for. So it'll be very kind of structured in that sense. Finally, we then have the rights revocation. So at any moment, everybody that has access to it can have that access taken away. So that if anything left, nobody could access it again. So all of this kind of comes together. When it all comes together like this, the channel monitoring that Iain mentioned changes drastically. So we don't necessarily need to look at the content of data anymore as it's leaving. We can just start trusting the labels. So if you have a label that's confidential, you just trust that you don't need to see what's in it as confidential data. So at Morgan Stanley, we're kind of moving towards this approach. of taking everything on-prem into the cloud. So while we do that, we're working with vendors and external companies, and we're making sure that they're prioritizing this exfiltration strategy just as much as we are. So for example, we want to make sure that we can do inline decryption. We want to make sure that we can apply these labels as part of our policies rather than just being able to see if it's encrypted or not. Going on from there, another thing that we need to start considering is our forensics tools and making sure that while we're going to the stage where everything's labelled, we can still use the tools. So incorporating them now so it makes the transition a lot easier. So stuff like being able to decrypt documents and read the content inspection before everything has this label that we trust. As I mentioned earlier, our forensics and our archive folders and stuff, they need to be able to extract the content so we can see why things are being blocked in the meantime. So before we get to the stage where everything is this new DLP approach, we need to kind of slowly phase it in, and while we're doing that, it's incorporating it gradually. So I don't know, Eve, do you want to start speaking about the other challenges that we're facing?
Yes, and I just want to add something to what Maria said there. So once we get to this position where all of our data is encrypted in place and can only be read on, let's say, a Morgan Stanley desktop by a Morgan Stanley authenticated user at a particular time of our choosing, we start to have to rethink what it means to have a data breach. So if someone removes one of these pieces of unstructured data, they can't read it externally. There's no data exposure. Have we still had a data breach or not? And you end up in these sort of like interesting philosophical conundrums. And I think it's probably going to be more of a perspective of, as security professionals, we know that our data is safe. We know that it cannot be read. It's no more risky than transferring data across an IPsec tunnel. Are our clients going to think the same? Will our regulators think the same? How much confidence will people actually have in this new security paradigm? And that obviously remains to be seen. It's very interesting to me that it's not only people like Maria and myself driving this new approach, but it's also people on the business side of our company. People want to be able to send documents externally and maintain full control of a document, potentially time bomb it so that someone can only access the document for 30 days or anything like that. So there's great security benefit, but there's also great business benefit to this new model. So anyway, some of the challenges that we have, just to wrap up, is that we have an immense volume of unstructured data in our companies, sitting on servers, hard disks, shares, just absolutely everywhere. We're going to have to retroactively go back through all those troves of data and apply protection to them. That's a massive task. An additional task to that is, how do we prevent the buildup of this unstructured data in the future? One of the things about data is it's often called data assets. These are our data assets. Every asset is also a liability. If you have this vast quantity of unstructured data sitting on your network, you have to do something about it because it in itself is a liability. So that's sort of one challenge, both from just a cost perspective, but also a technological perspective. And the other really big challenge in this particular sort of data protection mindset is what we do about structured data. So some of the biggest breaches are from users exporting data from structured systems, from databases, from enterprise applications, and exporting those. We need to work with application owners to build this in so that if someone exports data, it's protected. If someone runs a report, the report is protected. How do we protect the actual structured data in the database is another, or whatever data storage tool you choose to use is another sort of question. I actually think that that's it's a massive challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity for people who are looking in this industry for something they might want to sort of look at and potentially develop. No one really has a solution to these problems at the moment. So just to conclude, I hope the conversation's been kind of interesting. It's fascinating to me. I do think that we stand at the beginning of a shift in our paradigm of how we do this sort of data counter exfiltration. I did 10 years in the old world. Maria's just starting in this new world. I think it's very exciting. There are major opportunities. I just want to say, thanks for coming along. Thanks for hearing us. And if anyone has any questions, just throw your hand up and we'll gladly answer them.